In this video, I will be showing you how to put together my pouch kit from my Etsy shop. In your kit, you should have the pouch back and flap. You can request tooling on this flap, or I can leave it blank and you can tool it yourself. You will also have the pouch front. The pouch belt, which will connect the front to the back. The strap, which will serve both as the closure mechanism and a way to attach your pouch to your belt. And finally, the piece that strap will be going through. You're also going to need 2 needles, some waxed thread, some scissors, and a lighter, not shown here. To begin, you're going to take the pouch flap and back, and you're going to attach the strap to it. You're going to attach this here, this part, to the strap itself, and then finally this to this. It should look something like this when you're done. Alright, to start, we are going to attach the strap to itself. Take some thread, perhaps a foot. We're going to attach 2 needles, one on each end of this thread. You can sew back through the thread to keep your needles securely in place on the thread, like so. Do the same on the other end. You can sew back through, pull the thread down, and pull the needle through. The longer part is going to be the front, and that's where we want an X. On the back, we can just make a square. So when you're sewing through the front, you always want to sew on diagonals, and on the back, you sew on straight lines. It doesn't really matter which hole you sew through, first or second or third or whatever. Just make sure that you're always going to be sewing somewhere that you haven't gone before, and that the front is always an X, and the back is always a square. So I've made my initial X, and now I'm going to sew back over it, but this time when I come out the back, instead of going across, I'm going to go down. Because I've already sewn across here, so I'm going to go down to this one to make a square on the back. This is just a personal stylistic preference. It's not actually important for the bag. Sometimes in the past I've sewn an X on both sides by doing one stitch that's on one diagonal and tying that off, and then doing a second stitch on a second diagonal. So I'm going to stitch both of these out the side, and we're going to tie our knot out the side here. As you can see, I've got my square on the back, and I've got my X on the front. So tie these two together in a regular knot. You're going to cut off about 1 centimeter away from that knot, and then you're going to take a lighter, and you're going to burn the ends of these so that they burn down kind of like a candle, and either they will go out on their own, or you can snuff them out just before they reach the knot and then smush the wax into itself. Alright, so now we're going to attach the strap to the pouch. Again, we're going to take about 1 foot of thread, we're going to attach it on 2 needles, one on each end. And we're going to do the same trick again of sewing an X on the front and a square on the back. So I'm going to start by sewing that first diagonal of my X, so that's out where I can see. I'm going to choose a straight line or an orthogonal line for the back, and I'm going to sew the other diagonal of the X on the front. When sewing this part, you don't necessarily need 2 needles. I just find that it's handy to have the second one there in case that thread gets pulled back and I need to pull on it. A needle is easier to manipulate. Alright, so I've sewn a double X on the front, and now these two I can just tie the knot on the back, cut about 1 centimeter away, and then use a lighter to burn down those ends to where the knot is and blow it out and smush. Alright, 2 down, 1 to go. As before, put your needles on each end. You can sew back through the thread to lock them in place. Once again, I'm going to be doing that X pattern on the front and a square on the back. I suppose this would be a good time to ask if you like my videos to subscribe to my channel and like the video or leave a comment. This helps out with the growth of my channel and allows me to continue making these kinds of videos. It's good to note that it's really not important where on the back your needle is coming out, just so long as you're always sewing to somewhere that you haven't sewn before. You'll find that it's actually quite easy to make that square pattern on the back as long as you're making an X on the front. Alright, so when you're done, of course, cut about 1 centimeter away, burn that down, and then smush it. Now, take out your pouch front and that little piece that's going to make the closure for the strap. I'm going to start by just sewing it down onto one of the sides. For this, I just do a regular saddle stitch. So you're going to want to start with your thread even on both sides, and then each needle is going to pass through each of the holes from either side, like so. I decided that at this point I was just going to tie this off, and I pulled the thread back through, which both tightened it and made it so that I wasn't wasting quite so much thread. As usual with waxed thread, you want to cut your knot and burn it down and smush the wax onto it. So with the remaining thread, I put the other needle back on it, and we're going to sew down the other side in the same way. We're going to do a saddle stitch, so we want to make sure that it's even on both sides at first, and then sew through each hole with both needles. This side is going to be a little trickier because the leather is bending and it doesn't want to. Try to pull really hard to make sure that your leather is all the way in place, and then later we're going to wet and shape this piece. Waxed thread has the added benefit of kind of locking your stitches in place so that you don't need to worry about pulling tight these kinds of tough pieces. Alright, now we're going to sew the front and the back together using that belt. You can start with either side. I chose to sew it to the pouch flap first. So this time it's pretty important that the thread be the correct length, so I measure out 3 times the length of the belt and a little extra just for good measure. You don't want to do just 2 times because that'll be too short. You need to account for the thickness of the leather, so 3 times is usually what works best for me. This time I really want my needles to stay on there tightly as I'm working pretty hard with the pouch, so you're going to sew back through like you did before, but then you're going to sew back through again a second time through the thread that's kind of passing through that first. I'll show you again on the other side. So we thread our needle, we sew back through the thread once, then we pull up the part that's kind of coming through, and we sew back through that. You want to pull your needle all the way through, get that nice and flat. Match up your pouch belt with the flap as so, and you're going to sew through that first hole. And after you do this, you want to pull your needles so that it's the same amount of thread on each side. This is really important because we're going to be doing a saddle stitch. If you ever have a hard time punching through a hole, it's probably because the suede has jammed it up, so you can punch through the other side with a needle or an awl, and then you should have a much easier time. This first hole is critical, so after you've sewn through, make sure that your thread is even again before continuing on. Remember to tighten your stitches as you go. As you approach the bend in the pouch, you're going to notice that the pouch is going to start to take that kind of 3D shape. I wasn't recording, but when I get to the end, I usually sew back 1 stitch out through the side, and I tie my knot and smush it at the side there. So now we're going to sew the front of the pouch to the belt. To measure the thread, this time you can kind of curve it around the belt, like so. Do it 3 times and give yourself a little extra. Attach your needles on, as I showed before, and you're going to do your first hole. Remember, you can always punch through the other side to help get your needle through. Make sure that the sides are even. Since the stitches are visible on this bag, there's no special trick really to sewing on the front part. You're just going to do a regular saddle stitch as before. Make sure those sides are even after you've sewn through the first hole, and continue on. So this time I was recording, so you can watch as we sew our last stitch, and then I'm going to sew back through one hole and through the side with both needles. This can be a bit tricky sometimes, but then you're going to tie a knot there in the fold, as it were. So tie it down twice, cut away about 1 centimeter, burn the ends until they get close to the hole, and then smush it down. Now it's time for wet shaping. So get your pouch nice and wet. I usually run mine under the sink. And you're going to use your hands going on the inside and outside of the pouch to kind of poof out the edges around the stitches to counteract the inward curving that the leather naturally wants to do. So we're going to push, 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 push on the front and the back, on the back and the front, and the side. I usually kind of squeeze it so that it pops out like this. You can shape the buckle piece by bending each side so that it kind of makes a clear cut corner. You're going to have to do this several times as the pouch is going to want to go back to its original shape. It's going to take about a day to air dry. You're going to want to go back several times and reshape and make sure that your shaping is really taking hold. You'll notice that it's much easier to close your pouch once it's shaped. Once your pouch is dry, it's time to dye. I usually use EcoFlow dyes such as this all-in-one, or a gel antique, or you can also use just a plain leather dye. Just make sure you use an acrylic sealer afterwards. You're going to need something to apply your dye with. I use a piece of sheepskin, but you can use a sponge or even a paper towel. You're going to need something to wipe off the excess with. You can also use a paper towel, but I use a piece of cloth. You're also going to want some kind of dauber to do detail work. Alright, so take some of your dye and put it onto whatever you're using to apply it with. Make sure that you don't have just a big dollop in the middle. Try to spread it out a little bit. And then this step is the most important. You have to apply the dye as evenly as possible, as quickly as possible over the area that you're working with. This first initial pass of the dye is the most crucial. Then you're going to want to wipe away any excess. Once that initial pass is on there, then you can kind of work more slowly, but for this part you're going to want to really go as fast as you can to cover everything as evenly as possible. Otherwise you're going to have kind of some streaking, and you're going to notice uneven parts of your dye that for some reason don't seem to go away very much. This is particularly characteristic of water-based and alcohol-based dyes. If you use an oil-based dye, then you're going to notice that as it soaks in, it's going to more evenly distribute, but you're also going to get a much lighter color, and you're going to have to do multiple coats in order to get kind of a more full color. So as you can see, I'm applying with the dauber and with the sponge to get an even coat everywhere. For the strap, I'm going to do both the front and the back, but for the rest of the pouch, I'm going to leave the underside, the suede side, undyed. This is sort of a stylistic choice, but I also do it because I think that the suede side is nice when it's clean and white, and it's also so that the dye doesn't rub off on stuff that's inside the pouch. Using a dauber or a Q-tip, you can go over the edges of all of your leather as well. You can also touch up any little spots that you didn't quite get on your first pass. There's almost always going to be spots that you didn't get if you have tooling on your pouch. Those pesky little cracks in the tooling. So make sure that you really get all of those lines really well and wipe off the excess always. You can always go back over the areas that you feel like didn't get as dark as well. Depending on whether you're using an all-in-one or a plain leather dye, you're going to want to go over all of your work several times. Alright, so for the front, I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to try to, as quickly as possible, cover the entirety of it. To help get an even coat, you can also use kind of circular movements, which I'm going to do in a minute, but super fast. Whee! This helps get the dye evenly spread everywhere and hopefully will get away any of those streaks. I use a dauber to get inside the strap buckle. Make sure that you wipe away any excess. Sometimes water-based dyes will kind of build up on your leather and make these kind of darker spots, and you have to kind of buff them away to make sure that you don't have excess dye just sitting on top of your leather. I use the dauber to make sure to get the edges of the pouch here, trying my best not to dye the inside, the suede. You can probably guess how I'm going to dye the side now. I'm going to pass back and forth as quickly as I can, getting as much of the surface covered as possible. And then I'm going to go back in later to do any touch-ups and adding a little bit more to the dye. But that initial coat is really important that it's just as even as possible. Here I'm going to use the dauber to get the edges of the pouch. This is really important to giving your leather a finished look. This is sort of the first stage of what's called burnishing. So you want to make sure that there's plenty of dye on that edge. It's going to soak up a lot more than the rest of your leather. If you really want a nice shiny edge, you can go over this with something like Edge Coat, or do what I do, which is use a leather conditioner like Aussie, and then burnish it using a wooden burnishing tool. You just basically pass the wood over it several times until you smooth down that edge. But the coat of dye, I think, is what really begins this process. After you're done with the dyeing process, it's usually good, especially if you didn't wait several days to let your pouch dry, to go back and re-dye over particularly the front and the back of the pouch. The flap seems to usually stay pretty nice, but typically you're going to need to do at least 2 coats of dye. And then once you've done that, you want to go over it with some kind of leather conditioner. And there you have it. Thank you so much for watching this video, and I hope that you enjoy making your pouch.